Hey everybody, Russ Curlin back with another episode of Coach's Corner. I want to follow up from our previous episode where we talked about tones and tonal values in black and white photography and talk about contrast. The two topics are very closely related, and I think it makes a lot of sense for us to spend some time talking about it. So we're going to explore contrast in black and white photography, and we're also going to talk about methods to manage contrast both in the field and during post-processing. It's often said that black and white photography is all about light and shadows. Now, I don't necessarily disagree with that statement, but I think more accurately, black and white photography is about managing the relative intensity of light and shadows, or in other words, contrast. All right, so why was contrast invented? In other words, why is contrast important for black and white photography? Well, here are the reasons why I think that contrast is important. I'm not going to talk about these individually. You can read them. But I think of each one of them plays a very important role in helping to create a high quality and impactful black and white image. In fact, I'm going to go so far as to say, besides composition and basic exposure, contrast is one of the most important aspects to manage in black and white photography. So if you can master contrast and overlay that with good composition and good exposure, I think you have the potential for a really fantastic, amazing black and white photograph. Now, some common problems that I see with contrast in black and white photography, I'm going to talk about here in a moment. You may not agree with all those. You may have some pet peeves of your own. The first one is just too much contrast overall. Uh, Now, there are times when this works well. Makes a lot of sense, and it looks great for the particular scene and image. But I think there's a common misconception that all black and white photographs need to be high contrast. That's really far from the truth. A couple things that can come out of that, but also be standalone issues themselves. The first one is that we get no or low contrast in the midtones, those gray values in between black and white. But we can also get blocked up shadows and washed out highlights. In other words, no structure or detail. Again, that may be what we're going for, but I think in many cases anyway, a little bit of structure and detail in these areas adds some depth to your image. Another problem I see from time to time, it's really the opposite of too much contrast, is a narrow tonal range. And by that I mean a case where we don't have those deep blacks and those bright whites, where all the tones kind of scrunch together in the middle, like this example histogram here. Excessive, what I call micro contrast. What I mean by that is areas that contain naturally high contrasting textures or details such as rock, sand, grass, maybe wood and concrete. If we accentuate those textures and details and take that contrast to the extreme, it looks kind of unnatural to me and can be distracting. So we got to be very careful about that and balance that micro contrast. Now, at the end of the day, any of these may be acceptable. It really comes down to your personal preferences and the specific intent for the image. So just keep these things in mind. Just don't blatantly take the picture and convert it to black and white. Think about what kind of contrast do you want in your black and white image. Now, let's talk about managing controls, starting with in the field methods. We're not going to spend a lot of detail on these things. We could easily do a whole episode on each one of these, so I'm going to cover them pretty quickly. The first one is lighting. We can wait for the natural lighting to change, clouds to move in or to move out, or whatever the case may be. We can use or adjust artificial lighting. Now, I don't do a lot with artificial lighting, but this is certainly something you can do. Fill in flash examples. Use reflectors and shades. Composition, I can't come up with real concrete examples of where this might play in, but I suppose changing some framing a little bit by using different lenses, moving in closer, farther away, could, in theory at least, change contrast. Of course, exposure has a big impact. Metering method, spot versus average, matrix, some of those other methods that cameras have. So think about that. Manual adjustments, adjusting the EV up and down. ISO, of course, has an impact on contrast. There could be other camera settings, picture style, like standard vivid landscape, portrait, those kind of things. Scene contrast. My Nikon has what's called active D-lighting that can affect contrast. Only word of caution here is understand how, if at all, these settings may affect the final image if you're shooting in RAW, which I hope you are. In some cases, these don't save or hold when you're shooting in RAW, only when you convert to JPEG in camera. Uh, Filters, particularly graduated neutral density and polarizing filters, can have a big impact, particularly in skies and water. And then lastly, exposure bracketing, where you have those high contrast scenes, particularly landscapes, and then use those bracketed exposures for HDR blending during editing. Now, I do know that some cameras, you can do the HDR editing in the camera as well, but this is kind of a combination method. All right, so talking about methods in post-processing, again, we're going to go through these pretty quickly, but I will demonstrate a few of these when I jump over to Lightroom here in a few moments. The first one is to adjust black and white points, so that narrow tonal range we talked about, we want to stretch that out a little bit. Global controls certainly have an impact. Exposure and the contrast slider itself, highlights, shadows, and there may be others that you have. Again, coming back to that micro contrast in Lightroom, the three primary ones are texture, clarity, and dehaze, and I'll show you those. And a recommendation here, there's a YouTube video by Todd Dominy, whom I follow, called Using Micro Contrast to Improve Image Quality. Good video, explains a lot better these things than I can, so I suggest you check that out. Masks, especially luminosity, but also sky masks, object masks. I use these quite a bit, and these can be great for selective area contrast control. Color channels, color mixing, which is what we talked about in episode 3. That can affect contrast. And then lastly, the tone curve, which I'll talk just a little bit more here in a second. And again, this is not an all-inclusive list. The methods may vary depending on your own software, so get an understanding of what you have available and how those controls work. Now, the tone curve, this is the Lightroom tone curve. It's a graphical editing tool which plots tonal density versus intensity, okay? And here we just see a linear curve, and Lightroom has basically 4 regions that it applies that to, and it's laid over top of the histogram. I very often, you'll see this, adjust it to look like this, which is a standard S curve, which is out of my own old film days, very characteristic of film sensitometry. And I find this, I get a lot better control using the tonal curve versus just the contrast slider. The other thing I wanted to show you here is that if I draw a straight line over the majority portion of that curve, I get what's called the gamma line. The slope of the gamma line reflects the overall contrast. The steeper or more vertical that line, the greater the overall contrast. That's important. So as I move those points around or points in between, I can affect the contrast across the whole image or in specific regions. And we'll see that here in a second. So let's flip over to Lightroom real quick. All right, here we are in Lightroom. I want to demonstrate some of those controls that we talked about. I'm going to do this fairly quickly. Again, just to point out your software could be different, but I think you kind of get the idea. As I go through this demonstration, I encourage you to kind of pay attention to the different gray tones in the image and see what the impact is when I change the various controls. This is an image I took of a kind of a modern building in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And actually, it's not too bad as is. I could certainly live with this, but I like a little more punch and drama in my architectural images. So we're going to see what we can do here. The first thing, go up and look at the histogram. We notice there's kind of this dead area here. It's fairly well balanced on the left, but we could probably bring up the whites a little bit. So I'm going to zoom up and adjust that white point to the right. Not a whole lot. And you can see that it really brings this edge of this ring up quite a bit. Lightens the overall image, but not a lot. Then I'm going to go down and adjust this tone curve that we talked about. And I'm going to put that kind of that standard S curve in there. You can see what that does. That's pretty good. Now, what's nice about the tone curve is that I can add additional points, as many as I want here in the curve, and adjust any parts of the tonal curve. And actually, I think I'd like to bring down a little bit of the midtones, a little bit, not a lot. Maybe put another point in there, brighten that up a little bit, slide this point over. Okay. Um, Again, it's trial and error here, just to kind of play with it a little bit. It's totally reversible, so it's no problem. So I think that looks pretty good. Then I'm going to go up to what Lightroom calls presence. I'm going to start with texture first, which technically is not a contrast control. It sort of affects the sharpness and detail in small areas. And there's a little bit of, you see this water staining on the underside of this ring. It's kind of cool. So I'm going to bring that texture up. That's kind of nice. And clarity affects the contrast in the midtones primarily. And I use that a lot, particularly with architectural photos. So you can see how it's darkening the gray tones, the midtones, but not touching the highlights very much. So I don't want to go too far because, again, this is that micro contrast issue. We got to be careful with that. And dehaze changes the contrast in similar tones of gray. And in this case, I'm not sure that I'm going to do a lot of that. So maybe just a touch because it really affects the overall image. Okay, so that looks pretty good. I'm going to go down to the black and white mix now because I know that there are some colors there I may want to change, particularly the orange. This goes back to episode 3 that we talked about, so maybe take that down a little bit. Yellow, not too much. And then blue just affects that window in the background on the top left, so darken that up a little bit. Now, the only other thing that I really not sure I'm happy about is this area down here. It's a little dark. So what I'm going to do is do a little brush mask. This won't be perfect, but I just want to kind of illustrate what it does, just kind of paint that out a little bit. Then I think I'm going to bring up the shadows. I could bring up the exposure as well. You can see that just brings up that just a little bit. And the last thing I like to do on almost all of my photos, not everyone, but I like to play with this post-crop vignetting. It's technically not a contrast tool, although I suppose it is. And I think many times this can bring a lot of drama and intensity to the image. And just going through this real quickly because it's just something I'm pretty familiar with. So you can see what that does. It just really kind of vignettes, really focuses you in on the main subject here. So, all right, so that's it. Actually pretty happy with that. All right, let's finish up with some takeaways. The first one is a suggestion to select 3 to 5 or more black and white images by a bunch of different Vero artists and study the contrast in each one. Which ones had too much, not enough, or the right amount of contrast for your taste? And in which areas? Was it the highlights, the shadows, the midtones, or certain physical parts of the image? Just try to get an understanding of what you like and don't like about the different contrast applications. And then go out on your own and photograph a handful of scenes with varying contrast. Try different methods in the field to control the contrast. And then go back and edit those images. Experiment with different methods in your editor to manage the contrast. Which methods had the greatest effect? Which methods yielded the most pleasing results for your taste and why? And were there situations or areas within the images you found particularly challenging? Why? And what could you do to make it easier or better the next time? So think about those things going forward, and those might be opportunities to help you master contrast in black and white photography. So thanks for watching. We hope you enjoy this episode. As always, we welcome questions, comments, suggestions, and the teaser for the next episode. Again, kind of an extension of what we've been talking about, sky control. We're going to specifically talk about how to manage the appearance of daytime skies in black and white photographs. So take care, everybody.